Homes.com has collaboration tools to help home shoppers search, share, and discuss home shopping with family, friends, and their agent directly through the site. Though it was fun to get that email from your husband about that 3-bedroom in the hills, to which you replied via text that you would never live in the hills and you'd like to find a 3-bedroom closer to the beach. To which he replied, "Why are you so uncompromising?" A fun way to spend an afternoon, but we think it's just a tad bit easier our way. Homes.com.
Ding dong.
We've done your homework.
A life that's carefree needs hair that's worry-free. Have both with Maury. Reduce shedding and thinning in as little as 12 weeks with clinically proven, all-natural Maury nourishing hair care products. Others containing sulfates, parabens, and GMOs can actually weaken your hair over time. You can look great for holiday photos. Still not sure? We get it. So right now, purchase Maury at 50% off while it lasts. And take a quiz for a custom hair care recommendation at moerie.com. Results can vary. Maury is not a substitute for medical advice. See website for more.
You're listening to DNA ID, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Campus Killings,
and
Killer Communications.
All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
It was 1974. After lunch on a snowy Friday, the 15th of February, Dennis Anderson was in his car, returning to his home in a rural area of the town of Springbrook in chilly Dunn County, Wisconsin. He and his dog had driven the short distance to the Elk Lake store for some provisions, and after a brief shopping trip were on their way home. As Dennis cautiously motored down the snow-covered roadway, a small gold-colored car parked on the side of the road up ahead caught his eye. He saw a man standing on the other side of the car who appeared to have just roughly removed a young man from the back seat. The man threw the young person from where he lay on the ground into a roadside ditch and then started scooping and piling snow onto the person in the ditch. Dennis drove by slowly, staring, and made eye contact with the man throwing the snow, whom he later said was glaring at him. Dennis drove on, but what he had seen didn't sit well with him. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something didn't seem right. Maybe it was the blood he'd seen in the snow that was unsettling him. He turned his car around and headed back to the spot where the two people were fighting. The gold car was gone, tire tracks in the snow still marking where it had been parked. But Dennis's instincts that something was off were right. He could see unmoving human legs akimbo in the ditch. Dennis drove home and told his wife not to open the door to anyone. Then he called over to the house of his buddy Dan Murphy. He said, "There's a boy hurt down the road." Dan threw on his coat and jumped in his car, picked Dennis up, and they drove back to the scene. As they drove the short distance, Dennis told him about the fight and snow burial he had seen. When they got to the snowbank, they parked, got out, and looked down into the ditch. The person thrown in the ditch by the driver of the gold car was still there, partially covered by snow, lying face down on the snowbank. It wasn't a man, but a woman. Her eyes were open, with a bloody wound between them. Her shirt was partially pulled up her back. She had multiple bloody stab wounds, and she showed no signs of life. Dennis and Dan drove to the nearest house, a family they knew named Lawrence. Dan called the Dunn County Sheriff's Office at 1:15 p.m. The two then returned to the ditch area to wait for the deputies, and by the time they got there, a Culligan water delivery truck had stopped, and the driver said, "There's a girl in the ditch." "We know," said Dennis and Dan. Sure enough, Sheriff Darrell a.k.a. Corky Spagnoletti, the first officer responding to the scene, found a woman face down in the ditch with stab wounds to her body and 2 slashes to her face. She was still warm, but she was dead. The homicide investigation began. The autopsy on Snowbank Jane Doe at Sacred Heart Hospital in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, was attended by Sheriff Spagnoletti, several of his deputies, Dunn County DA Phil Stearns, Eau Claire Deputy Neil Hansen, and Eau Claire County Sheriff Donald Foss. Jane Doe was brought in wearing jeans, a maroon turtleneck, pantyhose, underwear, and rings on both hands. She also had a ring on a chain around her neck. Fortune cookies were stuffed into her pockets. All these things, plus Jane Doe's fingerprints, were collected. Photos were taken for dissemination to try to identify Jane Doe. Then Dr. David Angel performed the autopsy, assisted by Dunn County Coroner Dr. Sherman Lee and Dr. James Martins, the Eau Claire County Coroner. The victim was 5 foot 10 inches tall, 135 pounds, with light brown hair and hazel eyes. She had been stabbed 15 times in the abdomen, biceps, forearm, hands, face, left ear, and flank. She had a severe laceration between her eyes, likely caused by a blow from a hard object, and a stab wound to her nose that extended all the way into the nasal cavity. She had a penetrating stab wound at the front of her throat, a slash in her abdomen, and a penetrating stab wound in her abdomen. She also had 2 stab wounds in the back. One of these was near the left side of her back and the other near the middle of her back, almost coming through the front portion of the body. She also had lacerations to both arms. There was a laceration to the left hand, which went between the thumb and index finger and through the middle of the hand. The little finger on her right hand was severed at the last digit. She had put up a fierce struggle against the knife being plunged at her over and over. Aside from the knife wounds, Jane Doe had a broken nose and bruising on her body and face. The knife was a long, thin blade, possibly as long as 10 inches, long enough to pass through the body from back to front. The medical examiner felt that the victim was stabbed while standing, but Chief Investigator Sheriff Spagnoletti disagreed. He felt that she was stabbed inside a vehicle because of the angle of the knife wounds. The fatal stab wound was on the right side of her back. But everyone agreed that the cause of death was exsanguination due to multiple penetrating stab wounds. Time of death was at about noon on the day she was found. Scrapings from under Jane Doe's fingernails were collected. A sexual assault kit was done, tests were done for acid phosphatase, and smears were taken to examine for sperm. No injuries or tears were noted to the vagina, and less than 1 cc of fluid was present there. The pathologist concluded that Jane Doe had had sexual intercourse about 12 hours before her death. He didn't believe she'd been raped immediately prior to death, as fluid amounts were minimal and her clothes were not at all disarranged or in disarray. However, testing by the Wisconsin State Crime Lab revealed that there were intact sperm on one of the vaginal slides. Pubic hair combings retrieved 11 hairs, 9 of which were consistent with the victim's own. In her fingernail scrapings were traces of blood. Examination of Jane Doe's clothing revealed the maroon sweater had 11 perforations through the material and extensive blood staining. The victim had been stabbed while wearing it. Her jeans were also bloodstained. There was blood on her red tights and small bloodstains on her underwear. I believe these bloodstains were from the 2 stab wounds to her lower back, from which the blood ran down and soaked into her clothing. So the first step was, of course, to try to identify Jane Doe. As I mentioned, her fingerprints were collected, but they weren't on file. Officials from the local university viewed photographs of the young woman, but no one recognized her as a student. Dental x-rays were taken for comparison to missing persons cases. It was 1974, and no cell phones existed. People had to know the phone numbers of those they wanted to contact. In Jane Doe's pocket was a piece of paper on which were written 3 7-digit numbers that were quickly surmised to be telephone numbers. I'm not sure how Sheriff Spagnoletti figured out that the phone numbers were not Wisconsin, but Minneapolis area numbers. But he called area code 612 and one of the numbers and found it was listed to an Asian restaurant. The other 2 numbers were new numbers for the same restaurant. Someone at the restaurant guessed who Jane Doe, an employee, might be. Eau Claire Deputy Neil Hansen was enlisted to pursue this lead, and he contacted the young woman's next of kin, Donald Schlais, her brother. Donald met Sheriff Spagnoletti at the Smith Funeral Home and identified Snowbank Jane Doe as his sister, Mary Schlais.
Brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it. So your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Homes.com has collaboration tools to help home shoppers search, share, and discuss home shopping with family, friends, and their agent directly through the site. Though it was fun to get that email from your husband about that 3-bedroom in the hills, to which you replied via text that you would never live in the hills and you'd like to find a 3-bedroom closer to the beach. To which he replied, "Why are you so uncompromising?" A fun way to spend an afternoon, but we think it's just a tad bit easier our way.
Homes.com. Ding dong. We've done your homework.
So who was Mary? Mary Kathleen Schlais was born on November 4th, 1948, to parents Louise and Arnold Schlais. She grew up with her brothers Donald and James in Champlin, Minnesota. She attended Anoka High School. Her father played with the Chicago and Minneapolis Symphony Orchestras, and her mother was a judge in Jacobson, Minnesota. The parents were vacationing in Florida when Mary was killed. Mary grew up loving horses and was an avid horseback rider and horse trainer. Traces of manure were found embedded in the soles of her shoes, showing how much time she still spent at the stables. But Mary was an aspiring artist. She graduated cum laude with an art degree from the University of Minnesota, where she received several scholarships. When she was killed, she was enrolled in classes at the University of Minnesota's Studio Arts Department, working toward a master's in art. She had recently had an exhibit of her sculptures, paintings, and drawings at the Women's Institute for Social Change at the local YMCA. Mary was very accomplished and had traveled throughout Europe. She was fluent in German and Danish, and she had recently started studying Japanese. Her friend Rosemary E., interviewed by police, said Mary was a very hard worker and a dedicated artist whose instructors considered her to be talented. Rosemary told a local paper, quote, "She was a very outgoing person. She was an accomplished flautist, swam every day at the Y, and knew how to train horses for circus performances." Mary was slender, but in very typical 1970s fashion, she had recently been on a carrot juice diet to lose weight. The medical examiner noted in the autopsy report that the soles of her feet were yellow from the carrageenan in the carrots. Mary rented a room in the apartment of her friend Judith D., whom Mary had met in the summer of 1973 through her friend Louise N., a Japanese painter, and Louise's daughter Terry. Part of Mary's rent was paid in babysitting services for Judith's 4 children. Mary had formerly lived with her close friend Rosemary E., whose husband Tom was a well-known painter in Minnesota and who worked at the Minneapolis School of Art and Design. So as you can hear, Mary was firmly entrenched in the art world in Minneapolis and surrounded herself with artsy types, creators, and scholars. She was ambitious and determined to make a go of it as an artist. But art doesn't always pay the bills. So Mary worked as a dishwasher at the local Fuji-Ya restaurant on Tuesday and Thursday nights. She was very social and had several friends at the restaurant. After Mary's death, a new student art gallery at her alma mater, the University of Minnesota, was named in her honor. So Mary was living in Minneapolis, but that's not where her body was found. Instead, she was found on the remotest of roadways in rural Dunn County, Wisconsin, 90 miles from home. The location was 4 miles from the nearest interchange with Interstate Highway 94, where it met Eau Claire County Trunk EE. Just past Menominee and before Eau Claire is an exit for the village of Elk Mound. About 2 to 3 miles south of there, off County Road east-south, is the town of Springbrook and man-made 57-acre Elk Creek Lake. This wooded area is full of cul-de-sac streets and is very secluded and quiet. The rural roadway Mary was found on ended in a dead end and was so remote that investigators suspected that a local had to be involved in her death. Dunn County Deputy Craig Kozer later said, quote, "It leads you to believe it was someone who knew the area, but we don't know that for sure," end quote. On the other hand, the lack of massive amounts of blood at the scene led to the conclusion that Mary had been killed somewhere else and driven to the dump site. Blood drops in the snow showed that she had still been bleeding when she was dropped in the snowbank. And they knew from the witness, Dennis Anderson, that Mary had been brought to that location in a vehicle. Let's go back to the crime scene as police found it. Sheriff Spagnoletti was the first to arrive at the scene. Next would be Stan Mickelson with the Dunn County Traffic Department. This murder scene was a big deal in Sleepy Elk Lake, and soon other agencies converged on the scene, such as the Eau Claire Sheriff's Department, Menominee Police Department, and the Wisconsin State Patrol. That's a lot of people and vehicles on the tiny, narrow, dead-end roadway. And indeed, Robert Zebro, at the time an investigator for the Menominee PD who went on to become Dunn County Sheriff, said that upon his arrival at the crime scene, it was quite contaminated with the amount of people flowing in and out of where the body was located. And Dennis and Dan, the witnesses, had of course also walked on the side of the roadway. A jumble of footprints in the snow at the side of the road reflected where the killer had trod as he hurled Mary into the ditch, but they overlapped and were too erratic to capture. Shoe prints were impossible to be used as evidence, but the investigators did note some important tire tracks that had not been compromised. Tire tracks on the snowy roadway marked the spot where Dennis said the gold car had been pulled over. Deputies attempted to collect plaster casts of the tire marks, but the falling snow had already partially obscured them, and the fluffy, fresh snow did not hold the tread impressions when casted. So they had to rely on photographs to try to identify the make of tires, the measurements to calculate the size of the tires, and the vehicle's wheelbase. Blood collected from the snow in the ditch was human, type A, consistent with Jane Doe's. Hairs in the snow near Jane Doe's head were all collected. When her body was removed, Sheriff Spagnoletti saw yellow-stained snow under where she was lying that indicated to him that the suspect had urinated in the snow before dumping Mary's body in the ditch. To him, this indicated that the suspect was very cool and not in a hurry, as he said, until the witness Dennis came along. A sample of the urine was collected and forwarded to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. But the urine was not the most crucial piece of evidence found at the scene. Between the spot where the gold car had been parked and the spot in the ditch where Mary lay, an orange and black knitted wool hat lay in the roadway. The police reports perpetually refer to it as a stocking cap, but it was simply a typical chunky knit winter hat. Quote, "The stocking cap was determined to be related to the homicide due to its position toward what appeared to be the rear of the vehicle on the passenger side, slightly away from the tire marks and in between what would be the vehicle and the body," end quote. It was obvious that the stocking cap was handmade and was not manufactured commercially. The hat, too, was sent to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab for analysis. Okay, let's talk about the witness. Dennis Anderson, a construction worker, was questioned thoroughly about what he had seen that Friday. Here are some excerpts from his interview. Quote, "I turned right on the dead-end road, and I observed a car parked on the road. As I approached this car, I observed a body lying crossways to the road in the back of the car. The head of the body was toward the ditch, face down. I observed blood in the snow by the head. I assumed this body was of a young man, aged 15 to 16 years. A male subject was standing even with the passenger side door of the automobile, facing the south, away from the road. When I was about 30 yards from the car, I observed this male subject pick up the body by grabbing it by the seat of the breeches with the right hand and by the shirt collar with the left hand. At that point, he was in between the car and the body. This male subject threw the body to the south with a fling and a few steps. As I went by the parked automobile, the subject was squatting near the body in the ditch. about 10 to 15 yards before I got to the car and until 10 or 15 yards after I had passed the car, I and this male subject stared at each other." End quote. All that from Dennis. Dennis noted he was going very slowly, maybe 15 miles an hour, in second gear in his little Carmen Ghia. He said, quote, "The subject was throwing snow on the body to beat hell, and he was barehanded." Unfortunately, Dennis had not noted the license plate of the gold car, other than noting that it had Minnesota tags. But he had gotten a good look at the man who was now believed to be the killer of Jane Doe. He was white, 6 feet tall, about 180 pounds, 25 to 35 years old, with neck-length hair and a mustache. He had a long face and prominent ears. He wasn't wearing any outer garments, no hat, gloves, or jacket. He was wearing a simple pullover shirt with long sleeves. Dennis was asked to do an identikit composite, and a sketch was created, but Dennis later said he was confused by all the identikit choices, so a commercial artist from Menominee was employed to do a sketch from scratch, and Dennis said that one was more accurate. Newspapers ran the sketch of a long and thin-faced white man with center-parted, longish auburn hair, strong eyebrows, and a thick mustache, saying he was a suspect in the murder of Mary Schlais. The car description was a gold, American-made late-model compact, but as Dennis retold the story, the color morphed into light orange or amber, or possibly even light green. His description of the lights and a left-hand exhaust pipe, as well as the wheelbase measurements, determined that it was likely a Chevy Vega or a Gremlin. Sheriff Spagnoletti tracked down the Culligan delivery driver, Marv Gibson. Marv was shaken up by finding the body and had told everyone on his route that day about his traumatic experience. Unfortunately, Marv had seen nothing but the woman in the ditch. He hadn't witnessed any vehicles leaving the scene or in the area or seen anyone else around. Eau Claire Sheriff Foss took the photos of the tire tracks left by the suspect vehicle to the Co-op Tire Center, and he and the assistant manager, Denny, reviewed them. The tire size was very common, but Denny felt that the rear tires were wider, radial style, larger than the ones in the front. The tracks were identical to the tread on Miller recap tires, likely used on a compact car. The information was issued to area law enforcement agencies along with the color and possible make of the vehicle, in hopes that a vehicle could be identified.
Brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible. Financial geniuses. Monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it. So your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Homes.com has collaboration tools to help home shoppers search, share, and discuss home shopping with family, friends, and their agent directly through the site. Though it was fun to get that email from your husband about that 3-bedroom in the hills, to which you replied via text that you would never live in the hills and you'd like to find a 3-bedroom closer to the beach. To which he replied, "Why are you so uncompromising?" A fun way to spend an afternoon, but we think it's just a tad bit easier our way.
Homes.com. Ding dong. We've done your homework.
Police interviews with Mary's roommate, Judith D., helped investigators get a handle on the timeline. The two young women shared an apartment in a large house at 1921 Irving Avenue South in Minneapolis. They had been living there together since November 1973. Judith said Mary had worked at the Fujiya restaurant on Thursday night, February 14th. She wasn't sure how Mary got home. Mary didn't have a car. Sometimes she biked, sometimes she got a ride from other restaurant workers, and sometimes she hitchhiked. Hitchhiking was a very normal and common means of transportation for Mary and for thousands of people back in the 70s. Mary had once hitchhiked all the way to New York City. On Friday the 15th, Judith said, Mary left the apartment at about 10:30 a.m. to hitchhike to Chicago to see an art exhibit at the Museum of Art. She had been planning this excursion, a pretty long trip at 400 miles each way, for about 2 weeks. Mary had made an 8.5 by 11 sign on art paper that said Madison, so local drivers headed that way would pick her up. Once she got there, she would catch a ride to the Windy City. She was planning on walking the 4 blocks over to I-94 and holding out her sign for a ride. Judith was very helpful in reconstructing what Mary had been wearing when she left the apartment. She had been found wearing stockings, socks, jeans, boots, and a maroon sweater. But Judith said she was also wearing a 3/4 length bright green furry belted wool coat. After all, it was February in Wisconsin. She was also wearing a large yellow chunky knit sweater and a long blue knit cap with yellow trim. She was carrying a small overnight bag made of woven straw with pink trim and a brown purse. None of those latter items were found. Another witness came forward with some information. A Mrs. Paul Garnett of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, reported that at noon on February 15, 1974, she saw a small butterscotch-colored car traveling south on Eliza Wilson Road, heading toward County Trunk E. The car was speeding, which is why she noticed it, observing that she didn't think it would make the corner because it was going so fast and it was snowing. She saw only one person, the driver, in the automobile. Police discounted this sighting as the killer heading toward the dump site because they felt that it was not likely that he was driving in the area at noon when Mary was not discarded until about 1:15. But note that if Mary had indeed left her apartment at 10:30 a.m., 90 miles away, the car she got into could very well have been arriving in this area 90 minutes later at noon. Perhaps in the intervening time between the car sighting and when Mary was found, there was some kind of incident in which Mary was restrained or subdued and then beaten, stabbed, and discarded in the ditch. Investigators also spoke to a Gene Holtman, a milk truck driver who delivered in the Elk Creek Lake area on Fridays. Gene said that on the 15th, around 12:15 or 12:30 p.m., she saw a small orange car parked on the curve at Eliza Wilson Drive. No one appeared to be inside. This location was at the junction with the dead-end road where Mary was found, just 150 feet from where Dennis had seen it. Unfortunately, Jean looked through photos of cars and couldn't pick out the make of the car she'd seen. Investigators started pulling mugshots from Eau Claire of anyone who resembled the sketch made by the witness Dennis and showed them to him. He said none was the man he saw. They also pulled the license plate numbers of all Minnesota-registered vehicles meeting the description of the gold compact car seen by Dennis, and they looked at photos of the drivers to see if they matched the sketch. Police set up surveillance at the ramp to I-94 in Minneapolis that they thought Mary had gotten picked up at. It was the same day of the week between 10:30 and 12 noon. Only 2 cars that matched the description came along. Plate numbers and interviews led nowhere. Then investigators drove around the Kenwood area in hopes of observing a car that fit the description of the one they sought and bearing some type of snow tire. They found 2 and wrote down their plates and followed up. And then there was the orange and black hat found lying in the snow at the crime scene. Diane Hansen, an analyst at the State Crime Lab, found no identifying tags or markers on the hat. It appeared to be handmade. But the hat did have 40 hairs on it. 2 were animal hairs. The other 38 were human from an unknown blonde source. After 3 days, Sheriff Darrell Spagnoletti requested assistance from the Wisconsin Department of Justice Division of Criminal Investigation, or DCI. Special Agent John Schulz was assigned to the case. It's safe to say that there was one standout suspect in the eyes of the investigators early on in the Mary Schlais case, and that was the witness Dennis Anderson. We've seen this before, where witnesses who find murder victims find themselves in the crosshairs of investigators. Of course, Dennis stuck to his story that he was literally an innocent passerby who happened to witness something terrible. You know, it's something we true crime people don't talk about enough, and that's the impact on witnesses of the terrible things they observe in cases like this one. Police interviewed Dennis's wife, Kathleen, who confirmed Dennis's story that he was home with her and their 4 kids all morning until he left around 1 p.m. to go to the Elk Lake store. A short time later, Kathleen said, he returned home quite upset, loaded up a firearm and told her not to let anyone in the house but him. He later told her what he'd seen, and the whole town of Elk Lake was terrified and freaked out by the brutal and seemingly impersonal murder that had marred their idyllic village life. The investigators interviewed Dan Murphy, who backed up everything Dennis Anderson had said about finding the body. He also said that his dog had been barking like hell right before Dennis called on the phone. The body dump site was just a short distance behind his home. Doggy knew something was up before anyone else did. Police did not officially rule out Dennis, but they didn't have any evidence whatsoever to pin the crime on him, and his story about being at the store held up. The dog hair on the suspect hat didn't match that of his dog, and the human hairs weren't his. Police moved on to other suspects, and Dennis passed away in the early 2000s. His wife, Kathleen, was revisited in March 2008 as part of a re-examination of the cold case. She stuck to her conviction that Dennis had absolutely not had anything to do with Mary's murder way back on February 15, 1974. Kathleen said Dennis was never the same after the incident. He slept with a pistol under his pillow for about 6 months. He was always looking for the subject that he observed standing over the body on that date. Kathleen said he would say, "That vehicle looks like the one I saw down there." One of the things she recalled him saying was that the subject's eyes were very cold. She also thought that some of the alcohol problems that Dennis suffered from were because of the traumatic incident he could not put behind him. The police investigation transitioned into looking at people who knew Mary and might have a reason to kill her. Investigators interviewed Mary's brother Donald Schlais and his wife Judy. They didn't know of any current boyfriends of Mary's, but Judy's brother Richard and Mary had dated seriously for some time several years earlier and were now just friends. Richard was of interest because he was blonde and drove a small orange car. Police interviewed Richard, who went by Rick. He said he had known Mary for 7.5 years, and they had dated, but they'd been friends for the past 4 years. Rick said he had last talked to Mary on the phone on Friday, a week before she was killed. He said it was typical that when Mary was lonely, she would call just to talk. In one of their recent conversations, Mary told Rick she was involved with a married man, and the woman she lived with, Judith D., also overheard her saying this. Neither Rick nor Judith knew who this married man was. Rick also said Mary was infatuated with an artist at the art department at the University of Minnesota, but he didn't know his name, nor did he know whether this was the same married man Mary had recently mentioned. Rick had a verified alibi. He was at work at the City of Minneapolis Traffic Engineering Department at the time. Mary's roommate Judith told the investigators that Mary did not have a current boyfriend that she knew of, but she had heard something about a married man, and for the past 2 or 3 weeks, Mary had started staying out late at night. On the Thursday night before she died, she had actually been out past midnight, and on the night of February 12th, she never came home at all, not turning up until 10 a.m. the next day. Well, it sounded like Mary might have a new boyfriend. Police thought back to the coroner's report, which said that Mary had evidence of sexual intercourse maybe 12 hours before she died. Who might that have been with? A boyfriend. And if Rick and Judith were right, he was married. Police took note of the names of married men acquainted with Mary. Judith, the roommate, told police she was separated from her husband, John, but her husband had a married friend, Frederick A., who was about 35 years old and kind of strange. He was an art critic. John had told Judith that Frederick had told him he had some kind of relationship with Mary. Judith noted that Frederick fit the description of the man in the sketch, and he also drove a light yellow or cream-colored compact car. According to her husband, John, Frederick had a violent relationship with his wife. Frederick was interviewed by Sheriff Spagnoletti and Special Agent Schlais. He said he had known Mary for about 2 years, as she attended the studio arts department at the University of Minnesota, but he said they were only acquaintances. He said that Mary continued to take drawing classes on Wednesday nights at the university, but that, quote, Mary was not a good artist, end quote. That's rude. Isn't art subjective? But then he made up for it by saying that Mary was always very nice, and he felt that she was sensitive and a bit lonely. He said he often saw Mary biking and hitchhiking in the area. Frederick was again interviewed by Special Agent Schlais and Sheriff Spagnoletti on March 28th. They requested to take photos of him and asked for a hair sample. At this, their notes say he became rather indignant and called his attorney. After speaking with his attorney, he declined to give a hair sample. He said he felt he was being accused of something. It was noted that since his earlier interview, Frederick had cut his hair and shaved off his mustache. The investigators ran his vehicle registrations and discovered he had a yellow Plymouth Valiant, which didn't really match the vehicle in Dennis's description, but it had some similarities in that it was a compact and the exhaust was on the left-hand side. Quote, further investigation of Frederick A. will have to be conducted, a supplemental report says. Police also looked into Judith's husband, John D., an English teacher at the University of Minnesota who was enrolled in the same Wednesday night drawing classes that Mary attended. Rick had told them that John and Judith were estranged, but John had wanted to use Mary to help him get Judith back. John was a peculiar dude, said Rick, and police should look at him, and they did. Male co-workers of Mary's were also investigated. Hiroshi Mitani, a co-worker who sometimes drove Mary home, was of short-term interest because he drove a yellow Gremlin. But police found out it had broken down on Tuesday, February 12th, and was taken to Lindale Automotive in Minneapolis, where it stayed until Saturday. Hiroshi was off the list. Police also interviewed brothers Patrick and William McKern, who also worked at the Fujiao restaurant with Mary, and William was a student at the Minneapolis Art Institute. He said he knew that Mary was planning to hitchhike to Chicago that weekend. He said she was a very independent person who didn't think twice about hitchhiking. William said he had walked Mary home once or twice, but they were never intimate. He and his brother both said they never saw Mary with any men, and they knew of no boyfriends. They didn't recognize the man in the sketch. Mary's friends Terry and Marie were interviewed also. They described Mary as outgoing and friendly, someone who would talk to anyone, but who was also a little bit lonely. They knew Mary was going to Chicago. They gave the investigators the name of an ex, John S., an art student at the University of Minnesota. Also Cody C., who worked for the Parks Department. They also mentioned Rick D., Mary's brother's wife's brother, whom police had already eliminated, and Albrecht D., a student at the art center with whom Mary had reportedly had a loud and violent argument. Police wrote down the names of all Mary's male professors, men like Professor Nash, who said Mary was a hard worker and a serious person, someone whom everyone liked. Police had to look into all these men. From a police report, quote, the Wisconsin Department of Justice Bureau of Criminal Apprehension interviewed 5 men whose names have come up in the investigation and noted their whereabouts on February 15, 1974, the cars they drove, and whether they resembled the suspect's sketch. These were Thomas E., Albrecht D., John D., Cody C., and John S. End quote. The report notes that none of these men resembled the composite, nor did they have any idea who the assailant might be. The leads involving men in Mary's life dried up and stalled. Police were never able to definitively identify the married man Mary claimed to be seeing. The investigation widened to look at drivers of cars that fit the description of the gold car, men who looked like the sketch, and criminals who committed similar crimes. One very promising lead in this broad category was actively pursued by Dunn County Sheriff Daryl Spagnoletti. An owner of Ringle's Auto Repair Shop in Edgar called in a tip that a goldish-colored 1972 Chevy Vega had been towed to his garage for repairs, and inside was what appeared to be blood. The car was owned by Timothy F. of North Minneapolis. Chief Spagnoletti traveled to Marathon County to inspect the vehicle for himself. On February 19th, he obtained a search warrant, and numerous items were collected from the interior of the car, including a knit ski hat. Some stains were noted on the car floor that were sampled and analyzed by the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. Police started to look into Timothy, who had a mustache, long hair, and was slender, aged 21 to 22, but didn't really resemble the suspect's sketch because he was taller than the suspect at 6'8". They interviewed Timothy, who was very cooperative, and he had an alibi which checked out. This was that he and a buddy were at the Rusty Nail watching a lingerie show from 11:30 to 2:30 on Friday, February 15th. A tip was also called in about Lee E., an employee of a Minneapolis architectural firm that had Fridays off, looked like the sketch, drove a gold compact, was having trouble with his wife, and had a sister who lived right near the dump site, off highways H and E between Elk Mound and Eau Claire. Lee had been in an accident in Wisconsin on February 19th, putting him in the area. Lee was pulled in for an interview and hair samples collected. His hair samples were inconsistent with the suspect hairs from the orange and yellow hat. George B. was the subject of a phone call from the Racine County District Attorney's Office, who said George was suspected of killing 15-year-old Tina Davidson in Racine. As in Mary's case, some of Tina's clothing had gone missing. Furthermore, George resembled the sketch, and he was a felon with a recent record of indecent liberties with a female child. The Racine County DA had hearsay information that George B. had been in Dunn County on February 15, 1974, and orange and black, the colors of the hat they had found, were the high school colors of Burlington High School in Racine County. George's head hairs were collected by the Racine DA and compared to the hat hairs in the Schlais case, and his photo was shown to Dennis Anderson. This was a good lead, but ended up going nowhere.
Brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible. Financial geniuses. Monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it. So your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Homes.com has collaboration tools to help home shoppers search, share, and discuss home shopping with family, friends, and their agent directly through the site. Though it was fun to get that email from your husband about that 3-bedroom in the hills, to which you replied via text that you would never live in the hills and you'd like to find a 3-bedroom closer to the beach. To which he replied, "Why are you so uncompromising?" A fun way to spend an afternoon, but we think it's just a tad bit easier our way.
Homes.com. Ding dong. We've done your homework.
In May 1974, yet another very promising suspect emerged. DCI Special Agent Schlais was notified that a suspect was in custody on a double murder in Mankato, Minnesota. A couple had been hitchhiking from Kansas to Minnesota and were picked up somewhere along the route. The husband was found shot with a .44 Magnum. Intensive search of the Mankato, Minnesota area finally located the wife's body in a lake. She had been strangled with her own hair. In the search, they also located a box of clothing apparently belonging to the couple, which had the name of a Michigan man written on it. The name was Edward Richard Clark. A warrant was issued for Clark's arrest for murder, and he was apprehended in California. Because Clark had driven from Michigan to California, arriving on February 19th, and dropped his wife in Milwaukee along the way, it was suspected that he could have been in the Dunn County, Wisconsin area on February 15th, 1974. Clark sort of fit the description of the suspect and drove a gold vehicle, although it was a Ford Bronco, not a compact. Pursuant to a search warrant, his possessions were searched for any evidence of Mary's missing purse and bag, coat, hat, and yellow sweater, as well as a long, thin-bladed knife. Consensual hair samples were also requested and refused, so an agent from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension grabbed a bunch of hair after Clark had had a haircut at the jail. These were used for comparison to those found on the hat. They didn't match, and Dennis Anderson failed to identify Clark when shown his photo. Clark was ruled out. In the months after the crime, police conducted many photo lineups with Dennis. The men they showed him in the arrays included men from Elk Mound, Menominee, and Eau Claire, persons from the Minneapolis area who looked like the sketch, sex offenders, criminals, and all the men whose names police came across who seemed like viable suspects. They were disappointed time and again. Dennis clearly had a very clear picture in his head of the man he'd seen, and he shot down man after man. Dennis even went hypnosis twice, quote, in hopes that he would be able to recall more specific information, end quote. But these efforts were fruitless, the file indicates. In the hypnosis sessions, Dennis recalled that the driver's side headlight was crooked, the car had no plate on the front, and a hat lay in the road. But of course, none of that information pointed to a specific suspect. Mary's killer continued to elude police. The Dunn County investigators went down a major rabbit hole with regard to some potential suspects in the case who were all well-known associates and were involved in drugs. These were a Stephen Gappa, a Jeffrey Berg, and a Gregory Martin. It all started because Steve Gappa, who was already known to police, had been called in 1974 and 1975 by numerous tipsters, including his own girlfriend, who said he had told several people he had committed Mary's murder. A female drug dealer named Kathleen Powell also told police about Steve Gappa. She said he had told her and 2 others that he was the only guy in Eau Claire who had murdered someone and gotten away with it. He claimed he had murdered the girl found over in Elk Mound. Gappa apparently also told teenage associate Jeff Berg that he had done it, although Jeff said Steve was a known bullshit artist. Police looked very hard at Steve Gappa, who owned an orange and black knit hat and did look like the sketch, to the point that when shown his mugshot, Dennis Anderson said Steve Gappa could be the suspect he'd seen if he had a different mustache and hairdo. Gappa was interviewed by Special Agent John Schlais about whether he killed Mary. From Schlais' report, quote, "At this point, Gappa was asked if he killed Mary, and he said, 'I would have to say, no, I didn't do it.' In making the statement, Gappa hesitated for a while and appeared to be unsure of just what he wanted to say," end quote. Gappa said he heard Mary was screwing around with the wrong people and got in over her head. He said he would give a hair sample, but he wanted his attorney to be present. He was interviewed on September 19, 1974, with his attorney. Gappa said he really didn't know how the story got started that he might have killed the girl in Elk Mound. He went on to say, quote, "I am not involved in the killing of that girl. I believe it is somebody that I know, though. It looks like Jeff. Jeff owns a Chevy gold-colored 4-door sedan." Gappa went on to say that Jeff B. had a drug problem and was, quote, "very loose with a knife. He's also a very unpredictable person." He also thought the sketch could be of another associate of theirs, Greg Martin. A memo by Special Agent Schultz says, quote, "It should be noted that Jeff Berg, Gappa, and Greg Martin are all drug users, and Gappa and Jeff are heavy into drug use, and Greg is allegedly a big dealer. Jeff B. in the past suspected Gappa of the crime, and in turn, Gappa has suspected Jeff of the crime." Jeffrey Berg was interviewed after a major drug bust in October 1974 landed him in jail. He said he didn't know anything about Mary's murder, but he had owned an orange and black knit hat that he lost at a local bar called The Joint. He had heard Steve Gappa had taken it. Then it was found at the scene of the murder. The third man in this triptych of losers was Gregory Martin. Police were told that he looked like the sketch, he was violent, he lived near the scene, and he sometimes drove a gold 2-door Plymouth Duster registered to his brother. Martin was interviewed in the Eau Claire County Jail, where he was being held on a $50,000 bond on federal drug charges. He admitted he had previously lived in Elk Lake, but said he had never heard of Mary, denied killing her, and agreed to take a polygraph. I don't know whether he passed, but he willingly gave head hair samples, and police examined the duster and determined it was inconsistent with Dennis's description of the suspect vehicle. Finally, they showed Martin's photo to Dennis, and Dennis said he knew Martin from high school, and he was not the suspect he saw throwing Mary into the ditch. Head hairs from Steve Gappa and Greg Martin were compared to the hat hairs with negative results. There was no evidence in the extensive investigation that was done into Steve Gappa that suggested that he was responsible for Mary Schlais' murder. He took his own life in 1981. The investigation plodded on, with Special Agent Schultz from Wisconsin DCI continuing to assist Sheriff Darrell Spagnoletti. In October 1974, the Wisconsin State Crime Lab received a handwritten anonymous letter. It was written in very childish block letters and said, quote, "Did you ever think the man who found murdered girl at Elk Lake put her there, THEIR, end quote, BB Dunn County." The letter had been mailed from the Eau Claire area. That was it. That was the sum total of information the investigators had about the letter, which had no fingerprints of value on it. So while it seemed interesting and titillating, again pointing the finger at Dennis Anderson, it led nowhere. In 1975, Arnold and Louise Schlais, Mary's parents, were contacted by a Minneapolis man claiming to be a PI and former police officer, who said that he was interested in working the case on behalf of the family. The Dunn County folks, in turn, were suspicious of this man, last name Taggart, and felt that he was inserting himself and was unduly interested in the case. The family declined Taggart's help because he didn't seem to be bringing anything new to the table. But the proposal prompted Louise to write Spagnoletti a letter that read, quote, I've often wondered if the man were local insofar as your town was concerned, since he slipped away so neatly and knew the area so well. I am unable to imagine why she was killed. Do you have the vaguest idea? Is there something about the case that I am not aware of? And so violently. She was so anti-violence. I guess I shall never know, but it is something that lives with us still, day and night. Time has done nothing to make me accept this, but any other kind of death, but not this." End quote. Louise's letter perfectly captures the limbo the families of unsolved murder victims find themselves in. If Mary had died falling off her horse, the family would have mourned her, understanding her fate. The random and senseless stabbing and dumping in a snowbank by a nebulous, tall, stringy-haired white man, no one could comprehend. 1975 became 1976. In January of that year, Special Agent Schlais learned of a homicide suspect in Silverton, Oregon, Dwayne Edwards Samples. Samples was a Stanford grad with a degree in psychology who went berserk and attacked 2 women with a filleting knife. One of them, a friend of his estranged wife, died. Samples looked like the composite. In February 1974, he had longish hair and a mustache, and he drove a yellow VW Beetle. The Oregon authorities obtained a court order to obtain hair samples from Samples, and these were provided to Special Agent Schlais for comparison testing. The tests ruled Samples out. Schlais wrote in a 1976 memo, quote, "The victim," referring to Mary, "traveled extensively both in the United States and Europe and has always hitchhiked as a means of transportation. The most remote leads were followed in this case without success, and it appears this is a case where a lone girl was hitchhiking and was subsequently picked up and transported to her death." You can hear the tone of resignation in Schlais' narrative. He sounds defeated, almost acknowledging that Mary's killer, likely a random driver who picked up the hitchhiking young woman, was unidentifiable. Indeed, about 100 formal interviews of Mary's friends, acquaintances, and ex-boyfriends, inquiries into names that came up during the investigation, and hundreds of contacts and leads investigated failed to turn up a single solid suspect that stuck. Finally, early in 1976, the Wisconsin DCI closed their case as inactive. A John Schlais memo says a solid suspect simply never emerged. The case remained inactive for years.
Brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible. Financial geniuses. Monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it. So your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Homes.com has collaboration tools to help home shoppers search, share, and discuss home shopping with family, friends, and their agent directly through the site. Though it was fun to get that email from your husband about that 3-bedroom in the hills, to which you replied via text that you would never live in the hills and you'd like to find a 3-bedroom closer to the beach. To which he replied, "Why are you so uncompromising?" A fun way to spend an afternoon, but we think it's just a tad bit easier our way.
Homes.com. Ding dong. We've done your homework.
In May 1981, Judy Schlais, Mary's sister, called the DCI to pass something along to Special Agent Schlais. She had noted an article in the Minneapolis newspapers about the conviction of Joseph Ture, T-U-R-E, for the sexual assault of 3 women. Judy felt that Joseph very much resembled the sketch of the unidentified man suspected of killing her sister. She had learned from police in the Minneapolis Homicide Division that Ture had an extensive criminal background and had a fetish for waitresses and hitchhikers. And he'd confessed to police that he had committed the murder of Minnesota woman Diane Edwards by stabbing. Sergeant Jack Kulseth of the Minneapolis PD worked with the Wisconsin authorities to see if Ture had any involvement in Mary's death. Hairs collected from Ture were tested by a Diana Hansen of the Regional Crime Lab in 1982, and determined to be inconsistent, but police kept Joseph Tour on their list for years to come. In 1984, Dunn County Undersheriff Bruce Palmer took up the Mary Schlais case from a specific angle, the possible involvement of Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. I know, collective groan. Lucas and Toole were seriously investigated after confessing to numerous crimes in Wisconsin, and there was evidence they had actually spent time in Wisconsin and Minnesota. Palmer reviewed a chronology of Lucas and learned that he was in prison in Michigan at the time of Mary's slaying. As for Toole, there was no evidence he was anywhere near Minneapolis in February 1974, but a quote from Palmer's report. According to Otis Edward Toole, they were in Appleton, Wisconsin in April of 1980, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in May of 1980, and also may have committed a second or third Wisconsin crime in the area of Gordon or Westcott, approximately between those two dates. In April 1980, Ann E. Primesberger, a white female 19 years of age, disappeared from downtown Appleton, Wisconsin. After reviewing the reports of the Outagamie Sheriff's Department and Sergeant Bob Prince of the Texas Rangers, it appears that there is a fair certainty that Otis Edward Toole and Henry Lee Lucas did commit this homicide, because details were known to them regarding the victim's clothing, etc., which otherwise would have been impossible to know. Otis Edward Toole's psychological background appears to be rather horrifying. I would again point out, however, that he did not meet Henry Lee Lucas until 1976 in Jacksonville, Florida, and that he has got no link to the state of Wisconsin that is observable in February 1974. It is therefore this officer's opinion, at the present time, these two men directly, by themselves, do not appear to have had any link in the unsolved homicide in our county. End quote. Well, thank you to Investigator Palmer for not just accepting these serial confessors' word for it, unlike so many other investigators. Anyway, both Toole and Lucas turned out to have been incarcerated elsewhere on February 15th, 1974. Okay, let's fast forward to the late 1990s. Dunn County Deputy Craig Kozer took up the Mary Schlais case in March of 1997. He stumbled across the cold-as-ice case while his agency was moving the evidence room. He reviewed the entire file and met with DCI Special Agent Dennis Miller, who had been in charge of the case since 1997. The DCI had more files than Dunn County did, and they were not duplicative, so Kozer made it a goal to create one comprehensive case file with all the reports from both agencies. Deputy Kozer also met with Donald Schlais, Mary's brother, and his wife Judy. He told them he was looking into the case and over the next several years gave them periodic updates on his progress. Kozer kept a photo of Mary on his desk, reminding him that her murderer was still on the loose. He worked the case in his spare time, including detailed memos in the file of his theories and investigative inquiries. By the time he got through the file and prepared to start interviewing people anew, Dennis Anderson, the OG eyewitness whom the file reflected had been very cooperative with the investigation over the years, had died. So had the man who had come with him to the crime scene, Daniel Murphy. 23 years had already passed, and the clock was ticking on suspects, witnesses, and family members passing on. Kozer early on inventoried the physical evidence still in the evidence room, assessing whether anything was suitable for DNA testing. What he found was a bit worrying. Only one evidence box was actually sealed. Another box was tied together with string. A third package was an unsealed paper bag that had numerous sealed plastic evidence bags inside. And there were 16 items that were listed on the property sheet from the crime lab that were missing. These included the vaginal swabs collected at Mary's autopsy. Deputy Kozer noted that the evidence seals were intact on all the individual evidence envelopes. This gave him hope that perhaps some of these items could be submitted for DNA analysis. So in May and June of 1997, Deputy Kozer submitted 10 items to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab for DNA analysis. These included Mary's underwear, her maroon turtleneck sweater, her tights and jeans, and various hairs. The 1997 testing detected no semen in Mary's underwear. And in fact, Kozer wrote in a memo, quote, "The results of that examination did not provide any information that was significant in terms of evidentiary value," end quote. Well, he tried again in May of 2001. This time, the specific items Deputy Kozer submitted to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab in 2001 consisted of Item G, which was a slide holder reportedly containing 2 vaginal slides. These were examined by the crime lab in 1974, and intact sperm cells had been observed on one of the slides. And Item H, fingernail scrapings taken from the victim. Previous examination in 1974 revealed flakes of blood and a small amount of tissue-like material. This is from Kozer's report and reflects the continued optimism he had in the case despite all odds. Quote, "I believe that if DNA could be extracted from either item G or H, it may provide significant investigative leads for this case. In the interviews that were done, there was no information uncovered that could identify the person that the victim had sex with previously. Therefore, if identification could be made from the sperm on item G, that would provide a significant lead to follow up on. In addition, the victim had obvious defensive wounds on her hands, suggesting that she had a significant struggle with the perpetrator prior to her death. Therefore, I believe the fingernail scrapings would be extremely valuable if DNA could be extracted from them as well." Well, it was not to be. The crime lab report stated that microscopic examinations of the vaginal smears item G did not reveal the presence of spermatozoa or spermatozoa heads. DNA was isolated from the vaginal smears and the fingernail scrapings, but the conclusion that the crime lab reported was that the origin of the DNA from both sources were female and from the same person, Mary herself. The DNA angle was a bust, at least for the time being. In 2003, Deputy Kozer worked with Christina O'Brien from the Eau Claire Leader on a detailed article on the unsolved Mary Schlais case. In the article, he talked about the facts of the case and the disturbing reality that the killer had never been found. Kozer said, quote, "The thing that probably worries me most about cases like this is somebody that has the ability to go out and commit such a horrendous crime is still out there. I'd sure like to see them locked up," end quote. The July 2003 Eau Claire Leader article gave rise to what seemed like an important lead. Rocky Becker, a resident of the Elk Lake area who lived a short distance from where Mary's body was found, called in a tip. He reported that 2 years before the murder, the mothers of the boys' basketball team in Elk Mound had knit orange and black stocking caps for all players on the team. Deputy Kozer noted that the cap always had been believed to have been related to the crime since it was found so close to Mary's body, and that the owner of the cap had never been identified. This tip seemed to point to a local as the culprit in Mary's slaying. Deputy Kozer tracked down some of the men who had been on the Elk Mound basketball team back in the 1970s, but struck out on identifying a suspect. The 2003 article on Mary also gave rise to a July 2, 2003 phone call to Deputy Kozer from a Ruth Thomas. Here is Kozer's report. Quote, "Ruth advised that she is Mary's cousin. She said she was just calling to tell us she was glad the case has not been forgotten. She said Mary's mother, who was her aunt, felt that not much was done to investigate the case at the time. I explained to her the steps that had been taken and the extensive amount of interviews and investigations that had been conducted by DCI at the time. Although both Mary Schlais's mother and father are dead, I assured Ruth that the case has not been forgotten," end quote. And that very year, a prime suspect in Mary's murder would emerge.
Brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it. So your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Homes.com has collaboration tools to help home shoppers search, share, and discuss home shopping with family, friends, and their agent directly through the site. Though it was fun to get that email from your husband about that 3-bedroom in the hills, to which you replied via text that you would never live in the hills and you'd like to find a 3-bedroom closer to the beach. To which he replied, "Why are you so uncompromising?" A fun way to spend an afternoon, but we think it's just a tad bit easier our way.
Homes.com. Ding dong. We've done your homework.
In 2003, Deputy Kozer would focus on a suspect who fit well into the investigators' theory that Mary had been slain by a driver who picked her up hitchhiking. I'm not sure why this man was not looked at long before this time. He had been in prison since 1981, 22 years, before the Dunn County investigators started to consider him. But he was a prolific serial killer who was suspected to have slain many, many female victims, and he had a connection to Wisconsin. I'm talking about the I-5 killer, Randall Herbert Woodfield. Woodfield went to trial for the murder and rape of Sherry Hull and the attempted murder and rape of Lisa Garcia in Oregon in December 1981. He shot both women in the back of the head, but Lisa survived to testify against him. Woodfield was found guilty and is currently serving a 90-year sentence in Oregon for the murder of Sherry and the attempted murder of Lisa. He has been linked to at least 44 murders and 60 rapes in an 8-month spree in 1980 and 81, but he was never convicted of any additional crimes and never confessed to any. This from a long-form article on Woodfield in Sports Illustrated by John Wertheim, quote, "Cold case detectives have conservatively put that number, his victim count, at a dozen, although a few journalists and armchair detectives believe he's responsible for as many as 44 deaths. And that doesn't include a string of more than 100 other crimes, mostly robberies and rapes that bear his hallmarks. The I-5 killer's victims were mostly from the same subset, petite, Caucasian women in their teens or 20s. End quote. Woodfield's victims were all dumped along interstates along the West Coast in Washington, Oregon, and California. According to reports, his victims were all white women under the age of 30. So why would Woodfield be a suspect in Mary Schlais' murder? Don't worry, I'm getting there. Woodfield grew up in the Portland area with 2 older sisters in a firmly middle-class family. He was tall, good-looking, and outgoing. But as a teen, he committed indecent exposure, and his parents sent him to a counselor. The whole thing seemed to go away. But then in college at Portland State U, while a devoted member of his college chapter of Crusade for Christ, Woodfield was convicted twice of exposing himself and was arrested for several more such incidents. Because he was a star football player at PSU, these incidents were shoved under the rug, and when Woodfield's name was entered into the 1974 NFL Draft, there were no red flags on his record. Randall Woodfield was selected by the Green Bay Packers on January 30th, 1974. He was the undistinguished 428th pick. He signed with the Pack on February 26th. Woodfield attended the Packers' Arizona minicamp in April 1974 and made the team. He returned to Portland with a contract that afforded him enough money to quit his job at Burger Chef and required that he stay in shape and wear a coat and necktie in public. Then, on July 9th, 1974, he left Portland and reported to Packers training camp in Green Bay. Reports from coaches on Woodfield's performance were positive, but Woodfield could not keep it in his pants, literally. There were several incidents involving indecent exposure and flashing while Woodfield was in Green Bay, and due to this disturbing criminal behavior, he was waived by the Packers in August of 1974 and released on August 21st. He stayed in the area for some time, signing with the Manitowoc Chiefs football team in September of 1974, but eventually he returned to the West Coast where he went on to become the I-5 killer. So why does all this matter? Well, Randall Woodfield was a notorious serial killer who had been in Wisconsin in 1974, and his victims were all young, white women like Mary Schlais who were dumped off interstate highways. The dark-haired Woodfield did not look like the suspect sketch put together by Dennis Anderson, but it was a similar situation to when cold case investigators learned that Ted Bundy was in their area. He has to be checked out. Deputy Kozer wanted to know if he could place Woodfield in Wisconsin in February 1974. The question was, had Woodfield perhaps come from Oregon to Wisconsin in mid-February 74 in order to meet with the Packers after he was drafted, perhaps to discuss the contract he then signed on February 26th? Kozer was unable to find an answer to this. And his investigative notes say, quote, "In reviewing more information concerning Randall Woodfield, it was reported that he has refused to cooperate with law enforcement on any additional cases that he may have been involved in." End quote. Woodfield wasn't talking. Kozer was going to have to figure this out on his own, using the physical evidence available to him. In late 2006, Deputy Kozer discussed the Mary Schlais case with DCI Special Agent Ron Eben and the former case agent Denny Miller. On November 4th, 2006, the 3 men decided that given the crime lab's advancements in STR DNA technology, it was a good idea to resubmit some items of physical evidence for analysis. They submitted 4 items to the head of the crime lab's DNA section, Marie Variali. The submitted items were as follows: Mary's jeans, the stocking cap found at the scene, hairs found on the stocking cap, and the envelope that had contained the crudely written letter received after Mary's murder, pointing the finger at Dennis Anderson. In April of 2007, Deputy Kozer received the crime lab report. There was no useful DNA on the jeans or the envelope, but the lab had developed a partial DNA profile from the stocking cap. The scrapings from the inside of the hat had yielded a DNA mixture from 2 persons, and the major component of this mixture was consistent with originating from a male individual. The partial male profile contained sufficient markers for entry into the combined DNA index system known as CODIS. To everyone's surprise, the CODIS searches yielded no hits. But Randall Woodfield's DNA wasn't yet in the database, so he wasn't eliminated. In the 2006 to 2007 timeframe, Mary's case got some significant media exposure. In 2006, a book called The Wisconsin Road Guide to Haunted Locations by paranormal researchers Chad Lewis and Terry Fisk included Mary's case in a chapter in the book about a ghost who had been seen haunting Elk Lake Dam. This location was notably visited by a spectral, glowing woman in white and was about a half mile from where Mary's body was found. Local lore had it that the specter was named Mary. In more mainstream media, in 2007, Deputy Kozer worked with veteran Minnesota investigative journalist Carolyn Lowe on a long-form article on Mary's case. This from the WCCO TV piece, quote, Don Schlais is grateful the veteran detective, Kozer, hasn't forgotten his sister's case, even if it has long faded from the headlines. I guess I would like to face the person who did this to my sister, said Don Schlais. Don had been pushing the Dunn County Sheriff's Office for more exposure for his sister's case, so Kozer worked with Lowe to get the case back in the media, and they decided to run a previously unidentified photo with the article. I know I haven't mentioned it before, but one piece of evidence that was considered potentially very valuable back when Mary was first killed was a photo developed from a black and white slide found in Mary's room. This from Deputy Kozer's memo, quote, apparently, Mary was quite interested in photography, and that seemed to blend well with her interest in art. A photograph that was in the file when I originally took over the case was a black and white 8x10 of an individual standing looking at the camera, holding a glass, and judging by the background, it looked like it could have been a picnic or some type of party. When Don Schlais looked at the photograph, he believed it was taken at the park across the street from the band shell at Lake Harriet. The other thing that was significant about this photograph was that it bore a strong resemblance to a sketch that had been made by a police artist based on information provided by Dennis Anderson, end quote. The black and white photo was of a man whom 1974 investigators had been unable to identify and who remained unidentified. A picture of the man found in Mary's apartment was, of course, of interest to the investigators, since they still didn't know who Mary's new boyfriend at the time of her death was. Remember, the theory was, based on the sperm found at her autopsy, that she had had sex with someone at least 12 hours prior to her death. Her roommate, family, and friends had been unable to name a new man Mary might have been seeing, nor were they able to identify the man in the photo. As Deputy Kozer explained in the 2007 article, he wasn't sure that the photo was an important clue. Quote, whether it would help us resolve the case or not, we don't know, but it would just be one of those loose ends it would be nice to tie up, and who knows, it might lead us somewhere, he said. Well, he would get his wish. After the WCCO TV segment showing the 8x10 photo ran, Deputy Kozer got 3 tips from people about who the man in the photo was. 2 of them, in the deputy's opinion, did not look like the photo at all, but the third name was a little more promising. The man was named Ted S. Deputy Kozer contacted Ted S. and also contacted his ex-wife, Karen S. Quote, both Ted and Karen looked at the photograph and believe that the person in the photograph could very well have been Ted. Karen said she was about 95% sure that the person in the photo was Ted, and Ted agreed it could be him. But neither of them have any recollection of the photograph being taken, nor do they have any recollection of Mary Schlais, end quote. Basically, Kozer came to believe that the photo was indeed of Ted S., but as he wrote, quote, after reviewing the information from Ted and the rest of the case file, I do not believe that the 8x10 black and white photograph is significant to the investigation. In looking at the photograph, it appears that the camera angle is very low to the ground, as if the photographer is trying to be creative in their photographic technique, end quote. In other words, Mary was trying out different photography angles and happened to get a photo of Ted, who was involved in the art scene in Minneapolis and had probably attended some of the same events as Mary. Kozer concluded with, quote, Ted S. currently resides in St. Cloud, Minnesota, where he teaches at St. Cloud State in the art department. He has no criminal history, and I do not consider him to be a suspect in the death of Mary Schlais, end quote. And that was it for Kozer. He wrote, quote, no additional leads have been developed on this case, and on January 1st, 2008, I was reassigned from investigations back to patrol, and the case file was turned over to investigator Brad Leach. That concluded my involvement with the incident. Closed, inactive. In January 2008, investigator Brad Leach took over the Mary Schlais case. He was assigned to organize the file and prioritize leads, and the department would then decide what route to take as far as a continued investigation. Leach discovered that there really weren't very many reports in the Dunn County files. He contacted the now-retired Sheriff Spagnoletti, who had worked the case initially, and they met at a diner. Spagnoletti arrived with a backpack full of case materials he said he had accidentally failed to return when he left office. Reports were also missing that had been written up by the investigator for the Menominee Police Department, Robert Zebro, who went on to become Dunn County Sheriff, and by former Dunn County investigator Ron Marty Martinson. It's hard to solve a cold case if you have sporadic reports and missing files. Luckily, much of the physical evidence was still on hand. In March of 2009, Special Agent Dennis Miller and investigator Brad Leach met with Madison Lab DNA Supervisor Maria Variali. The purpose of the meeting was to go over possible evidence that could be resubmitted for DNA testing. They decided it was appropriate to submit the following items: Mary's maroon turtleneck sweater, a sample of asfid phosphatates detected at Mary's autopsy, and Mary's underwear. No semen or male DNA was detected on the underwear or anything else. They still had the DNA profile from the scrapings on the hat and the hairs on the hat, but that was it. They decided to exhume Mary. The hope was that they would find some residual foreign DNA that the 1974 pathologist had not known to look for, since DNA wasn't yet a thing. New DNA technology could prove the key to identifying Mary's killer if they could find some. According to a report by the Dunn County Medical Examiner, Donald Schlais, Mary's brother and only living relative at this point, authorized the exhumation of Mary's remains for this effort. He was all for it. He was thrilled that Mary's case was getting this level of attention after so many decades, and as he said, this could be their last chance to get justice for her. The exhumation took place at Champlin Cemetery, 812 Cartway Road in Champlin, Minnesota, at the plot labeled Block 58, Lot 1, Grave 2. In attendance were Deputy Leach, Investigator Brian Hurt of the Dunn County Sheriff's Department, Special Agent Dennis Miller, and Special Agent Ron Eben from DCI, as well as Dunn County Medical Examiner Chris Cruz. Once unearthed, the casket proved difficult to open, and the staff from the Ramsey County Medical Examiner's office had to use a K-12 gas-powered cutting saw from the St. Paul Fire Department to cut the locks off the casket assembly to open the lid. Mary was removed, and Dunn County Medical Examiner Chris Cruz transported the body to the Ramsey County Medical Examiner's office, where Dr. McGee completed a forensic autopsy on January 28, 2009. Mary still had her hair. The slash wound on her forehead, 2.2 centimeters long, was still evident, as was the stab wound to the bridge of her nose. The multiple stab wounds to her body were still identifiable as well. Dr. McGee's report states that the death of Mary Kathleen Schlais was due to exsanguination due to multiple stab wounds. He affirmed the findings of the earlier autopsy, which he stated was thorough and well done. He collected head and pubic hairs, fingernail clippings, and loose hairs on the body, and turned these items over to the Dunn County investigators for delivery to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. Mary was replaced into her casket and transported back to Champlin Cemetery for internment into the existing gravesite. I don't know what took so long, but the lab results were encapsulated in an October 10, 2012 DCI lab report issued to Special Agent Dennis Miller. They had tested Mary's pubic hair combings, the hairs on her tights, and the hairs on the knit hat found at the scene. In the pubic hair combings, the samples were Mary's own. The hairs on the tights were hers as well. From the hat, 38 human hairs were collected. 5 were selected for analysis. These hairs, 4 head hairs and 1 body hair, were determined to be Caucasian. Unfortunately, they were rootless and so were not suitable for nuclear DNA analysis at that time. However, it was noted that the 4 hairs were microscopically dissimilar to the known samples collected from Mary. The 5 hairs were submitted for mitochondrial DNA analysis and compared to mitochondrial DNA from hairs submitted from Randall Woodfield pursuant to his search warrant. The hairs were inconsistent with the hairs obtained from Woodfield. I don't know whether this was done at the same time or a later date, but the STR DNA profile obtained from the scrapings from the hat was also compared to the STR DNA profile of Randall Woodfield. The results were inconsistent. Woodfield did not kill Mary. Meanwhile, in 2011, Carolyn Lowe, the esteemed journalist who had written about Mary's case for years, wrote one last piece about the cold case, reminding the public that Mary's killer was still out there. Once again, she spoke with Don Schlais, who said, quote, "I don't really have any more anger after all these years. I just want to look him in the eye and say, what were you thinking? What were you doing? What happened?" He went on, "Sometimes it makes me extremely sad. I miss Mary a lot." Donald told Lowe he had one wish. If they're still alive, they have to face the toll of their actions and come forward and be an adult. Lowe reported in her article, quote, "The state crime lab did some extensive comparisons of hair found on the stocking hat with samples of at least a dozen suspects," Kozer said. "They were never able to make any connection based on that." This is the end of part 1 of the Mary Schlais case. Part 2 is available right now.